Hi there. You're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast, Episode 105, The Sixth Syrian War and Day of Eleusis. In September 180, Queen Cleopatra I Syria found herself alone. A princess of the Seleucid house by birth, her marriage to Ptolemy V of Egypt came to an end when the 30-year-old ruler suddenly died, with rumors claiming he was poisoned at the hands of his ministers. For the second time in a row, the premature death of their king left the dynasty in a precarious state, with Cleopatra left to safeguard her three very young children from the machinations of the court until they came of age and could stand on their own. She knew that she was going to have to remain steadfast. The last time this scenario happened, Queen Arsinoe III was murdered by her ambitious ministers only days after Ptolemy IV himself had passed, leaving Ptolemy V a puppet ruler for much of his early life. Cleopatra would not suffer from the same fate. Shortly after her husband's demise, the young Ptolemy VI was crowned king, but Cleopatra was appointed the title of Queen Regent, the first royal lady of her dynasty to do so. It was not merely a ceremonial position, but in fact gave her the power equal to that of the king, and in this case superseded her son. Between 180 and 176, all surviving documents list Cleopatra first, then followed by Ptolemy after, demonstrating her primacy in official matters. The prominence of her position is reflected in the terminology used in Egyptian documents. From various inscriptions and decrees, we know she bore a Horus name, the female Horus, and was proclaimed as the female pharaoh. Such conventions had only been applied for Berenike II Euergetes, and it is worth pointing out that these Egyptian titles had been given while Ptolemy V was still alive, so the transition of power to Cleopatra seems to have been an easy one. Coins were also struck in her name as well. One frequent image utilized was that of Isis, a goddess often associated with Ptolemaic queens, but we also know of a few rare specimens that are more explicit. Only one of two Ptolemaic gold coins to ever be discovered in the region, a 28-gram menaion dating to the reign of Cleopatra, was found near Tel Kadesh in Israel in 2010 by archaeologists. This hefty specimen, about 6 times heavier than a typical coin of the period, bore Cleopatra's name and title, Basilissa Cleopatra, and while the portrait appears to be that of Arsinoe II Philadelphus, it probably was a commemorative type to link her legitimacy to her deified predecessor. Earlier in 1978, the British Museum acquired a gold octodrachm that has the youthful bust of Ptolemy VIII on the obverse and a veiled queen similar to the menaion with the legend of Cleopatra around her image, thus further illustrating her role in governing the realm. As far as we can tell, Cleopatra's rule was unanimously accepted by the Alexandrian aristocracy, in spite of her Seleucid heritage. Indeed, with her brother Seleucus IV ruling as king in Syria, a war over Coele Syria could be avoided as she continued to groom Ptolemy to lead on his own. It may be no surprise that Ptolemy VI would be known by the epithet Philometer, one who loves his mother, given the generally positive reputation she seems to have held. Unfortunately, this idyllic situation was not to last. By 176, Cleopatra appears to have died. We have no indication that she was a victim of a plot, but she was only about 28 years old at the time, which was still quite a young age to die from disease or some other complication. Regardless, a 10-year-old child sat on the throne of Egypt once again. 2 court ministers stepped in to fill the vacuum left by Cleopatra. A eunuch named Eulaios and the former slave Lenaios became the guardians of the king. Eulaios was assigned to the king's person when he was an infant and later appointed his tutor, while Lenaios was in charge of finances to some capacity. Both men probably came from Cleopatra's personal retinue and were appointed to secure her position once she ruled in her son's stead. The employment of eunuchs was something introduced by Cleopatra from the Seleucid household, but the practice was heavily frowned upon by many observers. Polybius disapprovingly claims that the influence of Eulaios was poisonous on the developing character of Ptolemy, softening him with luxuries and effeminate characteristics that did not befit a king. Both ministers began to egregiously overstep their boundaries as well, as it appears that Eulaios had gone so far as to place his initials on Ptolemy's coins in an attempt to assert his authority. Yet the pair must have recognized that whatever symbols of power they wished to project stood on shaky ground. Their lowly positions as a eunuch and former slave did not earn them the respect of the other members of the court, and the use of Ptolemy as a prop would not shield them from the Alexandrian mob. One only had to look at the fate of Agathocles and his family being torn limb from limb to see what happens when they earn their anger. So they needed to take steps to assure that they would not suffer the same. Firstly, Ptolemy VI was married to his 9-year-old sister Cleopatra II in early 175. Both were known as the Theoi Philometores, the mother-loving gods, thus once again continuing the practice of incestuous unions in the dynasty, but the hope was to show a unified front even if they were far too young to have children together. Now projecting the image of a stable monarchy, illusory or otherwise, the ministers decided to appeal to the Alexandrian nobility by announcing their new mission, to reclaim the lost territories of Coele Syria. Since the peace agreement established between Antiochus III and Ptolemy V in 195, the issue of renewing a new Syrian war became increasingly debated among the factions of the court. Warhawks were rife, a fervor shared between landowners who lost their holdings in Coele Syria and those in the military looking to acquire plunder and restore the dignity of their defeat at Panium in 200. Even with Antiochus's death in 187, a northern campaign was unrealistic, given that the Great Revolt was still raging in the Thebaid, and would not come to an end for at least another year. After spending some time to consolidate his recovered territories in Egypt, Ptolemy V expressed an interest in launching a new expedition against Seleucus IV, but the anti-war faction is said to have assassinated him out of fear that they would have been heavily taxed to support the conflict. Recently widowed Cleopatra would not pursue the matter either. It is claimed that Antiochus intended for his daughter to undermine the Ptolemaic kingdom from the inside, and while she may have held a lingering fondness for her brother Seleucus IV, pursuing the matter was entirely unreasonable when her children were still so young, and given the circumstances of her husband's death. A change in attitudes can be detected a few years later. In the same year as the union of Ptolemy VI and Cleopatra II, the Seleucid Empire saw the death of King Seleucus, leaving behind his 5-year-old son in the control of the court minister Heliodorus. For a brief but lamentable moment, two of the most powerful kingdoms in the Mediterranean world had literal children acting as heads of state, manipulated by their ambitious advisors. However, the arrival of Seleucus's brother, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, saw him overthrow Heliodorus and usurp the throne of Syria thereafter. Antiochus's guardianship of Seleucus's son was clearly a sham, and it may have been alarming to see such an ambitious and energetic ruler taking command. In 173, Epiphanes' official Apollonius was sent to Alexandria to give a formal congratulations to the ruling pair for their coronation, but clearly his presence was less than welcomed by their frosty reception of him. Apollonius reported the hostility of the increasingly anti-Seleucid court, compelling Antiochus to start building up his forces along the border between their kingdoms. All of this saber-rattling would not be lost upon the Roman Republic. Growing tension between the Senate and King Perseus of Macedon made them extremely sensitive to the affairs of the Hellenistic East, and the prospects of a new Syrian war was not the situation they were looking for. In 173, a delegation was sent out to investigate the states of the Mediterranean, including Alexandria and Antioch. Principally, it was to see whether they would lend support to Perseus, but the commissioners verified that both parties had no such intentions. Antiochus himself had already taken the initiative to secure the Senate's favor by paying off the remaining indemnity of the Treaty of Apamea, along with some additional gifts to sweeten the deal through his own delegate to the city. If anything, a war in Greece was only to the benefit of either side, as it would leave the Romans preoccupied as the successors dealt out their centuries-old grudges, so if they could soothe their concerns to focus on Macedon, then all the better. The Third Macedonian War wouldn't begin in earnest until early 171, and during that time it seems that both the Ptolemaic and Seleucid governments were doing their best to prepare for when that day came. Antiochus spent time inspecting the defenses of Coele Syria, visiting Joppa and then Jerusalem, before heading further south into Phoenicia. Things were quiet until October or November of 170, when a surprising development in the history of the Ptolemaic dynasty took place. While Ptolemy VI and Cleopatra II were king and queen of Egypt, it was announced that the third Ptolemaic sibling was to be elevated to the status of co-ruler, now as Ptolemy VIII. The fact that he is known as the eighth of his name rather than the seventh will be explained in time. Egyptian texts dating to that year use the formula, the 12th year which is also the first, reflecting the regnal years of Ptolemy VI and the start of the new ruling triad, while inscriptions would follow by listing Ptolemy and Queen Cleopatra. Very shortly afterwards, Philometor underwent his coming-of-age ceremony. Whether he was crowned in Memphis like his father is unclear, but likely. It seems like a bizarre arrangement, but no doubt it was orchestrated by Eulaios and Lenaios. The reasoning may be somewhat sound. Ptolemy VI was 16 and Ptolemy VIII was 10. They would have had some semblance of relationship by now, and from all accounts it was not an amicable one. Jealousy could have spiraled into disunity, something that was undesirable when the kingdom was about to go to war against so fierce an opponent. By elevating the younger Ptolemy, the ministers hoped to placate any of his ambitions. At the same time, Philometor retained his primacy as evidenced by the Anacleteria, thus soothing whatever resentment that he may have held for sharing the throne. Cleopatra was the cooler head of the three, and acted as a mediator for her brothers. During a public assembly to the Alexandrians, the ministers announced that if they went to war, they would not only reclaim the lost territories, but destroy their longtime Seleucid rivals once and for all. Of course, Eulaios and Lenaios had no military experience of their own, but the high of gaining the enthusiasm of the crowds must have counted for something. They gathered many treasures from the palace, claiming that they would be used to bribe their way into the cities and fortresses dotting the Levant as they made their march northwards. Earlier in August, Epiphanes ordered the death of his nephew Antiochus, thus ending the charade once and for all and confirming himself as the sole king of the Seleucid realm. This action was publicly known since it was recorded by the Babylonian scribes, and news would travel fast. It is possibly what spurred on Eulaios and Lenaios to make a big celebration of the siblings' unity a couple of months later. At this point, Antiochus had no reservations against instigating open conflict. He had worked very hard to promote his image as an energetic king, funding many new building projects into nations across the Mediterranean world, elevating his status through an association with Zeus Olympius, and styling himself with divine epithets. Yet the one thing he lacked was a track record of military conquests, something that was essential to affirming his legitimacy. He was a usurper after all, and without any real enemies to fight barring some bandits in the Taurus Mountains, he was missing the final piece to secure his uncontested rule. With his nephew dead, he was itching for a fight. First Maccabees claims that Antiochus was envisioning himself as the ruler of not only a reinvigorated Seleucid empire, but over Egypt as well, something that was teased by his father but never carried to fruition. Nevertheless, missions were sent to Rome by both parties. The Seleucid official Meleager protested the aggressive actions of the Alexandrian government, while Ptolemy's representatives stressed the illegitimacy of the Seleucid control over Syria, claiming that it was stolen from his father and part of the dowry entitled to Cleopatra Syria. In November of 170, the moment of truth came to pass, as the Ptolemaic army launched an invasion from Pelusium across the border, thus officially beginning the Sixth Syrian War. Enthusiastic they may have been, but Antiochus was no fool. He and his government had spent years preparing for this moment. With his army at the ready, consisting of chariots, war elephants, and a whole host of cavalry, he caught and engaged the Egyptian army near Mount Cassius, Ras Korun, not far from the border of the Sinai Desert. Ptolemy's generals were completely taken by surprise and fled back to Pelusium. Antiochus purposefully chose not to have his men pursue or kill the fleeing troops, instead offering an armistice to give them time to recover. Epiphanes' generosity was no doubt a way to secure their goodwill, but he also managed to take Pelusium during the truce. We have no evidence of the tactics he used, but Polybius accused him of being underhanded and operating like a lawyer to follow the letter of the law, but not its spirit, which allowed him to seize the fortress with little resistance. With the capture of such an important stronghold like Pelusium, the door to Egypt was wide open for invasion, something which hadn't happened since the time of Alexander and the successors. This was disastrous for the unstable regime of Eulaios and Lenaios. To save his own skin, the panicking eunuch convinced Ptolemy VI to take as much money as he could pack and flee from Alexandria to Samothrace, leaving behind both Cleopatra and Ptolemy VIII to fend for themselves. It isn't entirely clear if Philometor followed through with this scheme, but Polybius alleges that he tried doing just that because of his weak character after associating with a parasite like Eulaios for so long. Ultimately, we hear no more of either Eulaios or Lenaios. An officer named Komnenos, the same Komnenos who ultimately defeated the rebel pharaoh Harunaphoros in 186, and a cavalry commander named Cineas had replaced the ministers at the head of a new council sometime in early 169. We may presume that their predecessors were executed as a matter of principle. Soon after acquiring Pelusium, Antiochus and his army pushed forward into the Nile Delta. We know his ships were following him along the coast as he marched inland, and by mid-169 he seems to have reached the former Greek colony of Naucratis, the westernmost regions of the Delta, and 100 kilometers, or about 62 miles, south of Alexandria. The Seleucid was making a considerable effort to live up to his reputation as a generous and merciful ruler, providing each of the Greek residents there with 1 gold stater each as a sign of his good faith. While encamped nearby, several delegates arrived to meet with Epiphanes. After the ousting of Eulaios and Lenaios, a new council of military officers agreed to send a mission to Naucratis to meet with the Seleucid king to discuss the possibility of peace. The leading Ptolemaic officials Teleopolemos and Ptolemaios were also joined by representatives from Achaia, Athens, Miletus, and Clazomenae, and so they presented their case once they reached their destination. Blaming everything on the machinations of Eulaios, they stressed Philometor's youthful naivete and his blood ties by way of Antiochus' sister Cleopatra, asking for forgiveness of any impetuous attack. After hearing them out, Antiochus spoke positively about all they have said. He did make a careful explanation about the unjust lies of the Alexandrian government about his family's legitimate right to Coele Syria in front of the other delegates as witnesses to his good deeds, and sent them all on their way to explain this to their king. With messages being sent back and forth between both parties, a rather strange set of events followed. It appears that Ptolemy VI traveled to the camp of Antiochus, where they discussed the nature of the war and eventually came to an agreement. Ptolemy entrusted his safety into his uncle's hands, who apparently promised to safeguard his right to the throne of Egypt as his protector. While we have no exact details of their treaty, Ptolemy was clearly intended to be subordinate to Antiochus' authority as a vassal king, and given the strength of the Seleucid army's presence in Egypt, it is not surprising that he would accept the proposition. This treaty was not well received in Alexandria, for though they could not possibly have stomached the idea that they were subordinate to a king in Syria. With Philometor in the company of Antiochus, Ptolemy VIII was elevated in his place to ruling king alongside Cleopatra, who weren't married to each other, but were recognized as the sole monarchs by the council. In turn, Antiochus laid siege to Alexandria, using ships to blockade the harbor to deny supplies from the outside, and starve them into submission. Not only did they have to deal with an invasion by Antiochus, but Egypt now faced civil war between the Ptolemies. A rare papyrus fragment preserves a letter apparently written during the war by a general of Ptolemy VIII, speaking of an attempted attack on a fortress near Pelusium by the forces of Philometor, only to be completely surrounded and captured or killed. Quote, "They, the enemy, mounted a vigorous spear attack, as a result of which it turned out that some of them rather overpowered our men, prevailing with their bravery, and being brave men and worthy of their native lands, they got control of the palisade and entered. But they were thrown into confusion by their own ranks because inside they were cut off and had no means to escape, and falling into ditches and canals, they perished by suffocation." End quote. Trapped inside Alexandria, Ptolemy VIII and Cleopatra sent a message to the Roman Senate, warning them of Antiochus's activities, and the possibility that the king and queen may soon arrive in Rome as fugitives from their own kingdom. Busy with their own conflict in Greece, the Senate ordered that a Titus Numisius lead a diplomatic party to visit Antiochus and try to broker a peace, but was unsuccessful in this venture. The siege of the city was proving to be more difficult than what Epiphanes bargained for, and by this point, probably in late summer or early autumn of 169, he had been away from his kingdom for many months. Rather than risk a potential rebellion at home, Antiochus decided to retire and return to Syria. This wasn't a complete abandonment from any future attacks, far from it. He continued to have a garrison in Pelusium, allowing him easy access to resume his invasion the next campaigning season, and installed Ptolemy VI as king to rule from Memphis. This also involved him sending envoys to Rome with gifts as a sign of his good intentions, but the tone had clearly been set. The Babylonian astronomical diary of that year celebrated his achievements in the campaign, when, quote, "Antiochus the king marched triumphantly through the cities of Melucha," possibly referring to some sort of victory parade among the cities of the Nile Delta. In the winter of 169-168, the three Ptolemaic siblings faced a challenging problem. The war thus far had proven to be an absolute disaster for the kingdom, and Antiochus was poised to strike again soon. Blood is thicker than water, or so it is said. Recognizing that Antiochus was merely trying to play them off each other until he would sweep in and destroy whoever was left, Philometor reached out to Ptolemy and Cleopatra, offering to put their differences aside and reunite as a family in the face of such an existential threat. They submitted their decision to the Alexandrians, who approved that the elder brother would be allowed to return to the city and restored to the throne. Despite losing his just cause, Epiphanes kickstarted the spring of 168 by launching his second invasion of Egypt. A fleet was sent to capture Cyprus, an important strategic site and one of the last bastions of Ptolemaic power outside of Egypt. Its ruling general Ptolemaios saw the writing on the wall and threw his lot in with Antiochus, gaining a high position within the Seleucid court. At the same time, Epiphanes led his army overland through Coele Syria near the border, where they were approached by Ptolemaic officials who graciously thanked him for allowing the elder Ptolemy to recover his throne. In reality, they were trying to sway him from marching forward, but Antiochus was insistent that he would not cease his operations unless they were willing to give up Pelusium, its surrounding territory, and the entirety of Cyprus. This obviously they could not do, and so the Seleucid army pushed again into the interior of Egypt. The depth to which Antiochus was able to penetrate into the Ptolemaic kingdom was far-ranging. Most important was his capture of Memphis. A very late source claims that Antiochus was coronated in the traditional fashion as pharaoh by the Memphite priesthood, and while we cannot confirm this, we do know that he established his own official kleon within the city to administrate. One extant document shows Epiphanes issuing a decree as the ruler of Egypt, providing an order to the clerics dwelling in the Arsinoite nome in the Fayum, which he seems to have renamed to the Crocodilopolitan nome as an attempt to dismantle the dynastic identity of the region. His control also extended into Upper Egypt, where a clay seal carrying his portrait was discovered at Edfu, and Seleucid troops must have occupied as far south as the Elephantine based on graffiti found on the island. yet Alexandria remained out of his reach. Its defenses would be formidable, but Antiochus would head onwards against the mother of all cities to deliver the finishing blow. No other member of his dynasty, not even his father Antiochus III Megas, had come so close as to achieve total victory against the hated Ptolemies, a perpetual thorn in the side of the family since the first squabbles over Coele Syria in the aftermath of Ipsus in 301. Now he was nearly the master of Egypt, poised to form a united empire that the world had not seen since the days of Alexander himself. That is how the story would have gone, but for a fateful intervention. On June 22, 168, Consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus delivered a resounding defeat against the Macedonian army outside of the city of Pydna, and within a few days received the submission of King Perseus, abolishing the Antigonid monarchy. The war had dragged on for 4 long years. Consequently, the Republic remained hesitant in involving itself in the affairs of the Levant. When Ptolemy VIII and Cleopatra issued their diplomats during the first siege of Alexandria the year prior, the Senate sent Titus Numisius to reconcile the royal family to no success. However, they also tasked one Gaius Popilius Linus with ending the war outright. This was not done until March of 168, and rather than head to Egypt directly, Linus traveled first to Greece, staying at Delos until the summer to observe events with the Macedonians and in Egypt before taking action. It seems that the primary concern was to determine whether the Seleucids would lend support to the Antigonids. Perseus already tried to recruit Antiochus's aid, claiming a natural alliance given their shared royal backgrounds in the face of Roman antipathy towards monarchies, but the Syrian king declined given his focus on the task at hand. Rome's victory at Pydna meant the end of the war, and in conjunction with Antiochus's march on Alexandria, Linus made his move. In July, Antiochus's camp was situated near a village on the outskirts of Alexandria called Eleusis. The king was informed that a Roman mission was approaching, and so went out to meet them. Seeing Linus, who carried a customary vine-cut stick and was flanked by his 2 subordinates, Antiochus shouted a greeting and extended his hands towards the Roman official. Rather than reciprocating the friendly gesture, Linus placed tablets into the king's hand, bluntly ordering him to read the message from the Senate. The Republic demanded that Antiochus abandon his siege of Alexandria, evacuate the Seleucid army from Egypt, and keep his hands off the throne of the Ptolemies. Taken aback by the severity of what he was asked, Epiphanes explained that he would need to consult his philoi before making such decision. Linus then took his cane, drew a circle in the dirt around the king's feet, and told him that he must make up his mind before stepping out of it. Antiochus paused for a moment, stunned at the audacity of this Roman delegate's actions, but soon acquiesced. He replied that he would do what the Senate thinks was right, and so at last Linus clasped his arm in friendship. Thus the Sixth Syrian War came to an end, with the Ptolemaic kingdom rescued from the brink of destruction. Known as the Day of Eleusis, this is one of the most famous episodes in antiquity and warrants ample discussion. From a first impression, the sheer arrogance of Popilius Linus, and by extension the Roman Senate, in delivering an ultimatum is quite shocking. The fact that Antiochus kowtowed to the Republic's demands on the verge of total victory with almost no resistance has, to some, signified Rome's complete dominance over the Mediterranean. From the onset, the Republic expressed relatively little interest in intervening in the Sixth Syrian War, choosing to merely sit back and offer some mild attempts at reconciliation. Even when specifically tasked with bringing the war to an end, Linus elected to wait and watch in Greece for the right opportunity for a few months versus heading straight to Egypt. The Senate may have had good relations with Antiochus and seemed to accept that he would wage war on his own terms, but Rome would never tolerate the potential threat of a united Syro-Egyptian empire. Polybius correctly noted the connection with the defeat of Perseus and Linus's decision to act. News of the Antigonid kingdom's destruction must have reached Epiphanes by this point, and the historian believed that without that potential threat, Antiochus would not have given up had he not believed that the Romans would have carried out a war against him. Humiliating as it may appear to be, Roman intervention may have come at an opportune time. For what it was worth, the siege of Alexandria was going to be a protracted effort. The Alexandrians were uncompromising and refused to acknowledge a Seleucid king. And now that all three Ptolemaic siblings were united, their resolve would be even stronger. Holding the Egyptian countryside was acceptable in the short term, but the time that Antiochus would have to spend in Alexandria meant he was away from home. He was already facing trouble in Coele Syria, and had yet to supervise the upper satrapies since he started his reign. If he were to conquer Egypt outright, this would likely require a dramatic reorientation of his empire. Some have even described it as an unwinnable war. I seriously doubt that Antiochus would not have leapt at the opportunity to destroy the Ptolemies had it presented itself, and whether he was aware of the complexities of absorbing Egypt into his administration at the time cannot be confirmed. However, the fact that Antiochus held friendly relations with Linus after giving up his conquests would suggest that it wasn't as big of a loss as it should have been, but was embarrassing nevertheless. With his acknowledgement of the Senate's demands, Antiochus began his evacuation in earnest. His troops marched out of Egypt, withdrawing the garrison from Pelusium, but taking their loot with them. Cyprus too was abandoned, and Ptolemaic suzerainty restored to the island. Having saved their kingdom, Linus ordered that harmony be the rule of law between the royal brothers, and departed Egypt not long afterwards. This was followed by an assembly led by one Numenius, a Pholoi of Ptolemy VI, who expressed his gratitude to the Senate for their timely intervention. We also have a few passing mentions by native Egyptians who witnessed the invasion. One of these was a letter dating to December of 159 written by Hor of Sebennytos, an Egyptian priest of Thoth living in Memphis. Hor claimed to be an oniromancer, citing dreams he had during the war which prophesied Egypt's salvation that he reported to local officials. One was a vision of Isis and Thoth walking hand in hand across the sea into the harbor of Alexandria, proclaiming the city's safety and the future of the royal dynasty. He also foretold that Antiochus was soon to retreat and perish immediately upon his departure, though this wasn't quite true, as we shall see. Among the list of grievances against the rule of the Ptolemies, a line from the pseudo-prophetic text Oracle of the Potter seems to reference the Seleucid invasion, describing a king of Syria who would invade Egypt and was hateful to all men. There is strong evidence that Seleucid troops plundered Egyptian temples during the occupation, thus explaining the hostility. With the Sixth Syrian War brought to a decisive, if slightly underwhelming close, what were the effects of this conflict? For starters, the extent to which Antiochus was able to demonstrate his skills as a commander showed that the Seleucid realm was still a major force to contend with. True, Roman intervention prevented him from achieving total victory, but his near conquest of Egypt granted him the glory and legitimacy that he needed to prove his right to the kingship. By allowing Antiochus to retain it, Linus essentially confirmed Coele Syria was to permanently remain in Seleucid hands, and that Ptolemy had no right to it. In a sense, this solved the key problem that is traced back to the initial dispute between Ptolemy I Soter and Seleucus I Nicator in 301. The war's end also safeguarded Antiochus from any future attacks, as he occupied his attention to the rest of the empire. Meanwhile, Egypt itself was totally devastated across the two Seleucid invasions. It is a genuine marvel that the Ptolemies continue to have a hold on power at this point, and some have seen the day of Eleusis as a shift in the decision-making of the Romans. It was their choice to abolish the Antigonid monarchy and render Macedonia inert, finally destroying the tripartite division of power that had dictated the politics of the Hellenistic world from its onset. It was due to their intervention that there was still a Ptolemaic kingdom left standing, and the Ptolemies' appeals to the Senate indicated their willingness to become a sort of client state, looking to Rome as its protector in return for their continued survival. This may be oversimplifying the dynamics of the Logids in relation to Rome, And the day of Eleusis is also a product of circumstance more than it was common practice. But the relationship with the Republic would be increasingly manipulated by the Ptolemies to their advantage, even at the expense of each other. All in all, King Antiochus had a right to be proud of himself, having achieved so much in a relatively small span of time. However, throughout the war, there was growing discontent within Coele Syria itself. The inhabitants of Judea were becoming increasingly agitated, and the factionalism that gripped the city of Jerusalem soon broke out into violence among some of its more zealous members. Epiphanes would not tolerate rebellious behavior at the height of his great war. Such disorder would demand severe punishment. On his return march from Egypt, the Seleucid ruler was on a trajectory course with the Jerusalemites and violated their great temple, leading to one of the most famous events in the dynasty's history, the Maccabean Revolt.